Go. All right. So I just wanted to say thank everybody for participating today, and I want it to be more of an exchange. If you could put your questions in the chat, and somebody could let me know what the questions are, I could stop the flow and go ahead and chat about it, because I really want to get to what is it that the audience wants to know about these particular topics. So it'd be great if you all did that. So don't be shy. Let's go on to the next slide, please. What's really relevant, and I was really excited about putting this together, is that these are topics that are so in the news right now, right? We're going to talk a little bit about the FireEye SolarWinds breach. And as a CISO, I'm in a lot of panels, I'm on a lot of roundtable discussions, a lot of webinars, and this is the most current topics we're talking about right now, as well as the supply chain, because it is such a risk to most companies. To all companies, actually, it's really a prevalent topic. So again, feel free to ask questions, and if you have anything that can add value to the conversation, please do that. Next slide. So we're going to jump right in, and I'm assuming most everyone's already heard about the SolarWinds breach, so I'm not going to insult everybody by explaining every single thing, but I do want to kind of level set it so that there, some folks who aren't super technical or familiar with what exactly occurred can understand what happened. So SolarWinds it was a supply chain attack, and what supply chain attacks seek to do is to damage organizations, and they target not exactly the hardened organizations, but they target their supply chain and vendors so that they can get a more easy access into a company. And that's what exactly happened with the SolarWinds breach. And I'm going to talk specifically about how the attack occurred, but it is so huge. It's been going on since I have a timeline I'll show you. It's actually been going on since 2019, but it became relevant to the public in around the middle of December. And we've been watching on a weekly basis as more and more data about this breach has started to unfold. The actual SolarWinds company is a company that provides a capability to help you with monitoring your network. So it's a super important capability. All companies do monitor their networks, and it's really important because SolarWinds has such an expansive view of an organization. It can see everything inside the network and enterprise environment. So it was a super huge feat for the APT to get into SolarWinds, and it was a big win for the APT, let me tell you. So they're considering this breach actually is one of probably the most consequential ones that we've seen in our history here in the United States, because of all the organizations that they were able to attack with it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But the SolarWinds Orion product is the one that we're specifically talking about, was the one that had the malware embedded in that. And those who you could be using SolarWinds right now, but you might not be on the version that was impacted by that. So it's good for you to know which version that you're on and which one actually was impacted for this discussion. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So how it was actually discovered, just as SolarWinds was releasing information that they had been breached, FireEye, who the CEO is Kevin Mandia, he almost announced simultaneously. And how FireEye, I'll get into a little bit more about how FireEye determined that they had actually been breached. But what happened was, a Sunburst, a malware called Sunburst, was dropped onto into a payload, and FireEye was impacted by it, and it was able to gain entry to, in particular, to FireEye. There are, since the first one dropped, which was Sunburst, over the last 2 or 3 weeks, it's come out that there's also an additional malware called Supernova, which is not necessarily linked to the APT that did do the Sunburst, but both are evidence that both are there. And then there's another one called Sunspot as well. So it's actually a third malware that's been detected, and it's a backdoor for moving, once the APT is inside the environment, to move lateral across the organization. Let's go to next slide. Okay, so who actually did this? There's been a lot of discussion. It was definitely a nation-state actor, and when it is a nation-state actor, we use the term APT, which is Advanced Persistent Threat. There has been tons of reporting on the fact that they do believe it to be APT-29, which is Cozy Bear, which is actually a Russian it's a Russian foreign intelligence. It is the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, and it has been linked to them as well. And the SVR has been responsible for notable attacks on the Pentagon in 2015, as well as the Democratic National Committee in 2016. There is another APT-28, which is another Russian bad actor, and it's related to the GRC, which is more their military arm, and it has a lot of common targets with APT. So they're not for sure exactly if they were involved in this as well. So there is SolarWinds got compromised through its vendor, and they're reporting that it's their vendor, and that's called JetBrains. And for a lot of you, you may know what JetBrains is, but if you don't, it's a development tool, and it's a pretty revealing attack that's occurred because JetBrains is a company that a lot of companies that do software development use these products. And the particular product at JetBrains was, in fact, TeamCity, which is their collaboration tool that a lot of developers use for a lot of different languages and such. So it's noted as, I've got a quote here from the co-founder of CrowdStrike, and he says that compromising and introducing a backdoor into a build environment such as TeamCity is the holy grail of a supply chain attack. So that's actually what occurred here. Is if you get into the actual code of a product and you're embedded in there, it's hard to detect that you're in there as malware and as malicious code, and you go unnoticed, which is what happened with this attack. Next slide, please. Okay, so it looks like we have a question. Okay, so answering the question, can you define what you mean by supply chain? Okay, so I mean, I'm not the Webster's Dictionary definition giver here, but I'll just say that for any company whatever products that you're using in your environment, so for example, Microsoft, Nessus, Splunk, or any big tools like that, would be considered part of your supply chain, as well as vendors that you use, what's called your downstream supply chain, to help you facilitate doing any work that you have to do or any managed services that companies do for you. That's what I would consider supply chain. So if anybody has a better explanation, it's just about anybody that you use, anybody's products that you use or services that you use that are not your own would be considered your supply chain. Oh, okay. Well, that's a good point. If you're dealing outside of IT, the supply chain is different. Yeah, definitely. But I would imagine that it's I don't know, to get into philosophical discussion, but I would say that it's any company that's providing you any type of service or product that you don't control anything in their environment, and they provide you services or products. Okay. All right. So why did this happen, right? So it wasn't we just happened upon it. This was a very, well thought out, well executed, I would call it semi-covert attack. In general, adversaries like the Russian FSR, they look to get information from other countries like the United States and other Western countries to see what kind of decisions are being made by our policymakers and our decision makers, so that they can get a little bit ahead of what's going on in worldwide politics. So there's a lot around that type of activity that goes on all the time. These particular actors aren't there. They're not doing this for money, and they're not doing it to damage anything. They're just truly trying to gain intelligence from this. What's really super important about the fact that we're highlighting the FireEye breach here is that FireEye is a big security company. Kevin Mandia is well known, well respected in the cybersecurity community, and he has a lot of government customers, consumers, defense companies, federal organizations, large big companies, and his company, in essence, kind of in a nutshell, actually goes into big companies and organizations, and they take a look at their cyber posture. They look at all their vulnerabilities, they map it all out, and they identify what are points of entry, what vulnerabilities do they have, what gaps do they have, how do they shore that up. So he has in his company huge databases of very sensitive data on a lot of very, very sensitive customers. And that's probably why, I mean, it hasn't definitively been said, but it's probably why FireEye was one of the first companies that were actually attacked and breached, was to get that information, so then they can see where are vulnerabilities within these other organizations that they've attacked, and see if any of them are something that they would want to target. And then it just makes it easier for them to target defense companies, defense organizations, and federal organizations, and others. So next slide. Okay, so this is a timeline. Don't want to talk about every single thing that happened, but I did want to note here that it actually started in September of 2019. They actually put the Sunburst code and deployed it in February of 20, and they did this very stealthily. Like I said, quietly, covertly. They got into the actual SolarWinds DLL, which is considered, it's called their dynamic link library. So they actually got into SolarWinds, got into their code library, embedded the malicious code inside the code. So it looked like, when it was packaged up, it looked like it was coming from SolarWinds. So there was no way that companies could see that there was actually, malware and malicious code inside of that package. And what happened is, when companies dropped the SolarWinds update into their environment, they actually loaded in the code without knowing it. There was no way to detect it. And then you can see there, if you want to know the details of all this, I'll provide this back to all of you if you would like a copy of it. So no need to jot all this down or anything. But in January 5th, we discovered the additional supernova malware. And then in, let's see, the 11th, we discovered the Sunspot was released into the wild, so that we knew about that as well. So, okay, next slide. All right, so where did it impact, and who did it impact? The SEC, and I'm getting all this stuff off of everything I'm telling you, nothing's classified. It's all in open source, and this is off of the SEC's website, but there was probably 18,000 customers of SolarWinds that were impacted, but the number that I have there is fluctuating between 240 and 250 of actual known announced victims. And so the victims that I have here is the United States Department of State, Treasury, Homeland Security, all these. And again, these were all this is all public knowledge. There's nothing classified about anything like this, but this is what makes this breach so impactful to everyone, is look at these organizations that were impacted by this breach. It was a very successful attack. Next slide. All right, and I'll go on to the next question. If many companies use the JetBrains tools, their way to audit and scan their current environments to determine that there's been a breach. Assume it's possible if they use JetBrains. Yeah, so I'm not a, I don't know exactly if you would be able to scan to tell it, but if you are using the JetBrains product, I would definitely get a third-party vendor to take a look at it to see if you, in fact, have been impacted. It's hard to say. They haven't released a lot of information about it, if they only impacted certain companies or if everything was impacted. So I don't really have a good answer there, and it's really hard to tell because of the way that they got in. So I would suggest, if you are using JetBrains, that you would have a third-party scanning company scan it for you and see if there's anything that they can find that doesn't look legit. Okay. All right. So here's what to do if I'm kind of trying to stay on track here. Sorry about that. But here's some things. This is not everything that you can do. What I wanted to do was just give you one slide that you could take away and look on locations. Just Google this, like go to Microsoft FireEye or CISA. There's tons of technical reports that's already been dropped on their sites about what it is that you technically should do. But some actions that you should take immediately is, if you do have the SolarWinds version that's been impacted, you obviously need to, disconnect from the internet. You need to, if you have the impacted version, you need to you have to blow it all away, and you have to read greenfield and start over with the new new patched version of SolarWinds if you're going to stick with that product. And then obviously there's things you can do, like make sure that you reset all the passwords in your environment around the product. You could do it against everything in your environment. Actually, it'd be a good thing to do, because a lot of companies probably were impacted by the malware, but they did not exploit companies unless there was something that they wanted to get out of it. And I would say that, the larger departments that they have attacked and successfully gotten into, and some of the bigger companies that have been compromised as well, they probably they're moving laterally in those environments, most likely trying to gain information. But some of us, just because you use the product doesn't necessarily mean that you are actually exploited by the breach. But just all kinds of reminders here, and apply least privilege, multi-factor authentication definitely helps, changing passwords and those type of things. So lots more technical information, and I can provide it as well if you have issues with finding this information yourself. Let's go to the next slide. So kind of just to wrap up this, the SolarWinds breach, talking a little bit about a quote here from the SolarWinds CEO. Now, this CEO, Sudhakar, just came in a couple days before they announced the breach. So he's brand spanking new. This guy's from a security company background, and so he's bringing in a new, set of eyes on what's going on here. The CEO that this breach happened under had been new to SolarWinds a couple years ago, and he's got a financial background, and he was brought in to obviously try to gain market share and raise their revenue. And in doing so, guys come in like that and they start cutting other things, and it was very evident, sort of become pretty evident, that they were taking some cuts across the board in security. And so we could probably attribute a lot of what happened to cutting of security and practices and things in the environment. But one of the things that the new CEO said is that our concern is that right now similar processes may exist in software development environments at other companies throughout the world. I'd be saying that too. I don't want to make it look like it's only my company that this is happening to. So and it's probably a true statement as well. But the part that I like that he said is that severity and complexity of this attack has taught us that more effectively combating similar attacks in the future will require an industry-wide approach, as well as public-private partnerships that leverage the skills, insight, knowledge, and resources of all constituents. So that's absolutely a true statement. And we're not going to solve, the world's problems right now with the SolarWinds breach, but it's definitely going to take, the industry, getting involved and policing itself, and a lot of everybody involved in it, just raising the standards up in the cyber hygiene, make sure you're doing DevSecOps and closing off all the vulnerable entries so that, things like that can't happen. So next slide. Now we're going to roll into talking about what we just talked about. There was really one of the worst situations of a supply chain attack that we've seen, like I said, in a long, long time. And that was very severe. A lot of attacks, most companies get attacked. Their supply chain gets attacked on a daily basis through other means. But what makes supply chain threats, very unique, not that the threats are different, but harder to deal with, is a couple of things here that we're going to talk about. And the first thing is that third-party vendors, suppliers, subs, there's all different kinds of names for them. What makes it difficult is that they are what I call the soft underbelly of a large company. So instead of going for, attacking, a large company, say Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, or some of these larger companies that have a ton of security and good practices in place, their supply chain gets attacked because it's easier to break into the smaller providers. And there's been lots of examples. For example, everybody knows Elon Musk, SpaceX and Tesla. It's probably pretty difficult to get into his environment, but all you need to do is go to one of his subcontractors, Visser Precision, which is already this is a public knowledge thing. They were the supplier, Visser Precision, was breached, and data from SpaceX, from Tesla, from Lockheed Martin, and other big vendors who use this particular sub, their data was breached as well. That was it was a ransomware attack in particular, but the data was easily taken from that sub. So again, that's a lot of the reasons why the supply chains are the most riskiest places for large companies. Also, too, is getting transparency into the supply chain is very difficult, and for reasons that's very understandable. A lot of companies have very unique solutions or products, and they don't want anybody to have visibility in there because of their IP, and that's what gives them their competitive advantage, and they don't want to lose any competitive advantage. So sometimes you have a hard time getting information out of companies like that. Obviously, releasing proprietary information to a company who they don't know, if they're your supplier, they don't know how your security is either, so they don't want to release their information to you. So that's understandable. And there's other things too. Sometimes that they give you a look into your environment, and a company doesn't think that their suppliers cyber controls are to standard. There might be some criticism there, and they definitely don't want to see that. So lots of reasons why they don't want to open the door and let you in there. The other things are, it's even if you identify that there is a problem, it's difficult to understand the scope of how things are going to go down when you don't have visibility into that environment. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen there. And there's lots of evidence of, if there's an instance of something happening in one environment, it can cascade all the way down the supply chain or up the supply chain as well. And I could talk a little bit about that. The supply chain is the supply chain of the supply chain is virtually unknowable. I can give an example of listening to some peers discuss around having a customer, a government customer, and they had to build a box, let's say a box, and it was supposed to be made in the United States only. So the government gives the contract to the primary contractor and says, hey, here's your contract, and we want you to build this box, and it needs to be made inside the United States. So they go and they get a vendor that helps them make it, and they pass those clauses down, and they say, hey, you need to build this for me, and it needs to be made in the United States, and we need this many of them. What happens is each supplier has a supplier, and as it goes down, it can go 2 and 3 and 4 levels down, and eventually the clauses don't flow down, the contracts don't flow down, and then it ends up that the box is being made in China, right? So now the whole entire product development's been compromised, and the prime who's contracted with the government has not only lost the contract, they're probably going to lose a lot of money for all the money they've invested, and the fact that they went against what the government told them to do. So there's lots of things like that happen every day, and you all probably have tons of stories that you can tell as well. But it's super difficult to get visibility into your supply chain, and to understand what's going on, and to make sure that it's a safe supply chain. So that's the unique problems that we deal with, and that's not all of them, but there's tons more, but it's a good start. So let's go to the next slide. So now we've talked about how hard it is to manage your vendors and understand how secure your supply chain is. And what I wanted to do was give you at least some ideas about things that you can do for your supply chain to get visibility of it, and to manage the risk that you have in your supply chain. So the first and foremost is always, starting with ensuring that you have compliance and regulatory guidance and standards that you have within your company on how you manage your vendors, and then you flow that down, right? So you publish those policies, you get them to your suppliers and your vendors, you get them in your agreements, you get them in your contracts, so that everybody understands what the expectation is for them to secure their environment. Every single contract's different, so I'm talking in great generalities, but making sure that you get as much into a contract to protect you, to give specific guidance to your vendors and to your suppliers is first and foremost. A lot of people use the word crown jewels, and if you have crown jewel vendors that are they are the center of gravity or the key to you delivering a product or a service, you really should get them under SLA, service level agreements, and OKRs, so that they can understand that they have to stick to specific guidance that you give them, as they're delivering their products or services to you. It's a good thing to know, identify who your high risk vendors are. That they could be high risk for many reasons. There's lots of criteria. It could be that they are a mom and pop organization that does engineering like to the greatest degree, but they're just a small company and they don't really have good secure practices, and you consider them high risk, and then you might give a little added attention to them by sending, if you're a large company, like a cyber assistance team to help them to secure the CAD documents or classified data or whatever it is that you're giving them that they need to build products for you. And then the other thing is to obviously have a process or means for which, verifying security practices and procedures, within your supply chain. The second piece is adopting strong, scalable, repeatable processes. So, again, depending upon the size of your company, but most, small to mid-sized companies have, some sort of procurement process, and you can make sure that that's a repeatable process and that you do things the same there, and you push into contracts specific guidance to them that you specifically want them to, perform on. Again, having processes for securely dealing with vendors, having them come in through portals where their identity and who they say they are, and that they're using multi-factor authentication, things like that. And also too, what's good to know is to develop, again, with some of your high-risk vendors or your crown jewel vendors. And if you could do it to all of them, it'd be great. A company like SAIC, we have 10,000 vendors. So it's really, difficult to manage down to every specific one, but certainly prioritizing them and determining which ones do you really rely on and need to know if they are having an incident, and how do we communicate during an incident that they're having. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so know which vendors are receiving controlled data. This is more from the defense space, but a lot of you are probably in companies where you might deal with HIPAA, PII, ITAR, CUI. That's more defense type data. And the fact is that if you're flowing that kind of data down to a vendor, you need to make sure that you're flowing down with them specific guidance around how to protect that data. And if there's government standards out there or frameworks, make sure that they're familiar with it. It's in the contract so that they do protect the data, so that you don't have a loss of data. Restricting access and authorization. If you have vendors coming into your environment or into your portals or some sort of supply portal or something like that, just making sure that they don't all get to come in at the same level and do whatever they want. You really control and restrict the access to the level of data that they actually need, and that better helps you control the loss of data in your environment. And then interacting with the vendors routinely, having them do self-assessments, and again, if they're a priority for you, assessing them, if it's allowable in the contract, and auditing, and also working with them and conducting training. And then the fourth way to help manage it is to employ adequate threat detection and response. And it depends on obviously the size of company that you have, but obviously for mid-size or larger companies, if you're running your own security operations center, or if you have it as a managed service, make sure that there's tools in place so that you have visibility and continuous monitoring of the network. And if there's tools out there so that you can get some sort of identifiable data about your vendors. There's BitSight and other products like that where you can see what their security score looks like. And there's things that you can do for if you have capabilities to look on the dark web, as far as if you have key vendors that you're using, make sure that you're searching dark web for a release of data about any of the companies that you consider a key vendor. Creating crisis action plans and executing those and doing tabletop exercises. Again, mid-sized, larger companies do those routinely, so that when you do have an incident, your teams know how to respond and exactly what to do. And a lot of them involve vendors. So, I'll just give you an example of if you have employees whose accounts have been compromised on an ADP site or something like that. It's a payroll site, and in order to stop the bad actors from changing people's ACH payments and things like that, you have to work with vendors, and so you have to have plans and exercises on how to do that so they go smoothly if something happens real world. And then conducting, again, another process is conducting vendor risk assessments to see who is what is their postures and where is there risk in particular, and then if it's a crown jewel or high risk supplier that you use, you help them shore it up so that you can keep your supply chain as secure as possible. So that was kind of fast and furious, and that's certainly not everything that that can be done. But I did try to spend a lot of time putting together, some thoughts about different things that you can do. And I think that these 2 slides about managing risk, you could certainly tear these out and make sure that your company's doing as many of these things as you can to make sure that you're improving the ability to manage the risk of your supply chain. Let's go to the next slide. And this is just, again, another takeaway for anybody here who has a company that you might be responding to any supply chain threat and incident. Some of the things that you do, like I talked about, is you implement a communication plan. And then at the time that you need to use it, you activate the communication plan. You make sure that you get all the key people involved. It's always usually your cyber team and any of the business that it's impacted. If it's a financial function that's been impacted by it, and any sort of third-party providers, suppliers, like I mentioned, ADP, or it could be, you name it, any company that's helping you do your finances, and making sure that all these people can get into the same room on the same call so that we can start to hash out what has gone on with the incident. And basically the bottom line is you're trying to come to understanding of what's happened, how do you remediate it, and how do you shorten the duration of the disruption so that you can return to normal operations as soon as possible. And then the last slide, I just thrown it in there for a lot of mid-sized to larger companies use. They leverage the intelligence cycle, and I actually at SAIC we do leverage the intelligence cycle and use a threat-informed defense model. So it helps us to stay on top of what's going on in our environment and with our suppliers, those that we have the connection with to get the data from, and makes for a easier way to handle situations if you already have good processes in place. I don't know if I've missed any questions in the chat.
Yeah, I think we've got a response from Kevin regarding this 4th malware that was found by Symantec called Raindrop.
Oh, Raindrop, yeah. Actually, I'm going off of really bad memory here. I thought Raindrop was a malware that they found, but it's actually is used to move laterally within an environment. I don't know. I'm kind of guessing right there, but I'd have to check it out and find out. And if anybody's on this call who knows exactly what it is, you could speak up too, or put it in the chat.